Poor David. He just can't seem to catch a break. It was a pretty bad winter this year. Aside from the generators needing to pick up a few times, the hospital came to work one morning and found the hot water off. This caused quite a lot of problems, as you can imagine, since patients like to take hot showers and doctors like to wash their hands in water scalding enough to make their skin blister. David was called in to fix the problem, since his counterpart was in bed with the flu. David had just gotten home, just started getting ready for bed, in fact, but he put his overalls back on and came to see if he could fix the problem. What he found was the last thing he expected. He told me all this as he sat at the desk and drank hot chocolate with both hands. He had to hold the cup in two hands because they were shaking so badly. David's been doing this job since before I got here. He's no stranger to the oddities that happen in this hospital. Even so, he said this was probably one of the hardest things he's ever seen. I've never seen anything like this during the day. Some weird stuff goes on around here. You know that as much as anybody. But it usually happens at night. The weird stuff happening during the day, that's new. The idea that it could happen at any time really weirds me out. He had started to ramble a bit, not really making much sense, and I asked him if he felt comfortable talking about it. He said he wouldn't have come to talk to me if he didn't, and leaned right into the story about the boiler man. This place is old, you know that much, but I don't think you know how old some of this place is. There are parts of this place that were built in the 70s, but there are other parts that go back all the way to the 30s. I started this job in '93, probably just about the time you stopped crapping in your diapers. And I remember when the undercellar had these big boilers. They used to heat the whole hospital. They were ancient when I got here, and they changed them out about 5 years after I started. They were constantly going out. They were unreliable as all get out, and I was glad to see them go. Not just because they needed constant work, but because of the way I always felt when I was in that basement. I've seen some spooky places around here, but that basement is one of the spookiest. Sometimes you'd be working down there, working on the water heater, or the boiler, or the furnace, and it would sound like somebody dropped a pipe. The basement under the hospital's huge, but you could hear someone drop a pipe down there from a long way back. Other times it sounded like somebody yelling, somebody really screaming down there. But when you went to look, there was nobody there. I asked some of the other guys about it, and they all told me that it sounded like I'd run into the boiler man. I asked them who the boiler man was. They all started grinning and asked how I hadn't heard about the boiler man yet. I was just a kid, a little younger than you actually, and when I said I never heard of him, they told me the whole story. Sometime back in the 30s or 40s, there was a maintenance guy who was responsible for the boilers and the furnaces down there. The hospital was a little smaller then, but it still needed heat and hot water to operate. So that was this fella's whole job. Day in, day out, all he did was work in the basement and mind the boilers and the furnaces. Got to the point that he got to be kind of a hospital spook, and some people claim that he never left at all. Some of the other maintenance guys said he had a cot down there, and he just slept down there next to the boilers and kept the place running all day and night. Well, he did, till the place took care of him in the worst way possible. They say that one winter there was a terrible noise from the basement. People went to the stairwell that led down, and all you could see was smoke and steam boiling up out of the guts of the place. The other maintenance guys went down there to see what had happened, and they found that one of the boilers had fallen over and taken out the one next to it. They had taken out 3 boilers and a furnace, to be specific, before the wall had stopped its destructive rampage. The more they looked, though, the more they realized that that wasn't all it had taken out. As they looked for the boiler man, they started getting nervous when they couldn't find him. Had he been down there when the whole place blew? Had he taken the day off, maybe? As the emergency crews started clearing stuff away, They found the poor guy smashed between two boilers. He'd been trying to stop it from falling, and they had returned the favor by smashing him flat. He was burned almost beyond recognition, and they found that some of the rumors about him had been true. There was a little alcove with a cot and a bookcase, a little hot plate, and some food for his dinner. He'd been living down in the basement, and it appeared that it had been the death of him. That was the way I heard it, at least. And any time there was a weird noise down in the basement, the other maintenance guys just said, "It must be the boiler man." I'd never really believed in him, not right on top. I've seen enough weird stuff in this hospital to make me not question too much of the other spooky stuff that happens. That being said, I'd never seen any evidence of the boiler man in the almost 30 years I've been here. I've seen the ghost girl. I've heard enough people talk about Shaky Leg Mary that I have to believe it. I've checked the phones up on the 3rd floor for your buddy Mark enough times to know that something's going on up there. But the boiler man, that was never something I put a lot of stock into. At least, till this morning. So the new boilers are all on a switch. They're like Christmas lights. If one of them goes out, they all goes out. It's an interesting system, and it'd be a pain in the ass if it weren't for the fact that the computer that's down there can pinpoint exactly which one is messing up the system. It doesn't happen very often. They've got that system pretty tight, but there's about 15 of them down there, and 2 of them were the culprits this morning. So, I took my toolbox, checked the computer, and pinpointed the 2 that were giving us trouble. I got to work on the first one, and it wasn't a real hard fix. Some rats probably got into the wiring. They usually look for somewhere warm to sleep when it's cold, so I started fixing the wires so I could get home and get some sleep before I gotta come back tonight. I'm working on the circuit when suddenly I hear something hit the ground towards the back of the basement. It was like a big metal pipe being dropped, real loud. It rattled all through the basement, and I jumped about a foot and hit my head on the underside of the boiler. I probably taught the boiler man some new words that day, but the bastard had it coming. I listened real close, trying to figure out what the noise was, but after a few minutes I just chalked it up to rats and got back to work. I've almost got it hooked up and ready to flip back on when I hear another pipe hit the ground. This one's a lot closer, maybe next row over, and I holler out to make sure somebody's not down there playing games. I would've thought maybe it was the daytime maintenance guy, Lou. He's a bit of a trickster, but I heard the way he was snorting when I called him on the phone, and I know he's laid up in bed with the flu. I got up and looked around with my flashlight a little, but I couldn't see anybody. It was just me and a lot of quiet old machinery. I closed up the boiler and went to check the computer. Wouldn't you know it, I only had one left to go. I turned back to find the next one, and that's when the lights went out. That ain't really nothing new. You'd be surprised how often the lights go out in the basement. I figured it was the same problem that probably tripped those boilers, and just kinda got back to work. I took my flashlight out so I could see to work, and expected that the power would come back on about the time I got done. If there's one thing you can count on down here, it's that the power's gonna come back on at the least opportune time. So, I set to work on the next one, and God almighty, is this thing screwed up. If it was rats, they had really been at this one. But I kinda doubted that vermin had anything to do with it. It looked like someone had been trying to take it apart. The front panels were off, and some of the fuses and wires were sitting on the floor. The whole thing was a took-apart mess, and as I started putting it back together, I got that feeling I always got when I worked down here. The feeling of being watched. That feeling of something on the ceiling looking down at me. I looked up a few times, shining my flashlight around as I tried to find the source of it. I didn't see nothing, but as I worked, I became aware of a weird shuffling noise. Like I told you, there are definitely rats down in the basement, but this sounded different than that. This sounded more like footsteps. Sounded like when you were a kid wearing flip-flops and your dad told you to pick your damn feet up. Sounded for all the world like somebody dragging their feet along the ground, and I looked up more than once to see if somebody else was down here. I called out, even got up and walked around the basement to see if I could see anybody, and the lack of anybody to be seen was making my skin crawl. It took me about 2 hours of working in the dark down there, but I finally got it back together. I walked over to the computer, not really expecting it to work, what with the power out, but found that it was still up and running. It told me that everything was operational again, and I turned to leave when I heard the most gut-wrenching scream I'd ever heard. It was like listening to a deer that's gotten caught on a fence. The kind of scream you know is going to lead you to find something that's been gutted. I should have left. I should have left right then and got security, but I had to prove that I was still a tough guy. The boiler room was my domain, and I wasn't about to let some weirdo roll around down there unchallenged. I picked up a wrench from my toolbox, taking a ball-peen hammer in the other hand for good measure. Then I made my way out to see if I could find the source of the noise. As I walked between the furnaces and the boilers, their little pilot lights winking in the gloom, I held the wrench out to defend myself if someone should jump out at me. I didn't expect that they would. I'd searched around down here a few times and found nothing. In my mind, I was just being paranoid. There was nothing down here. It was all just stories that I felt I was too old to believe in anymore. There was no boiler man, no spooks down here to jump out and scare me. And soon, I'd go back upstairs and go to bed and not think about any of it till the next time I had to come down here. When the thing shambled out between two boilers, I thought for sure I was having a hallucination. It looked like one of those things in a Romero movie. Its skin was burnt and broken. Its head was hairless and scabby. Its eyes were white and sightless as they stared off and did nothing. When it turned its head to regard me, I could see that its mouth was open and full of broken teeth. It was wearing the tatters of a uniform, and I could see that it was the same one I'd worn when I first started. There was a name stitched over the breast on the left side, but it was charred. I could barely make it out. When it screamed at me, I turned and ran as the wrench hit the ground. He chased me through that murky blackness for what felt like hours. Being stuck in the stairwell was the worst experience of my life, but this was a close second. I could hear it right behind me, its bare feet slapping at the concrete, and the longer I ran, the more sure I felt that it would get me. No matter how many turns I took amidst all those boilers and water heaters, I never seemed to find the door. It was tireless in its pursuit, and as I ran, I seemed to be looking for the hole that I would trip in. I've seen enough horror movies to know that there's always a hole or a pipe or something to trip on so that the monster can eat you up. Thankfully, it never came. As I rounded a set of units, I saw the stairs in the beam of my flashlight. I almost couldn't believe they were real, and as I tripped my way up them, I could swear the creature was still right on my heels. My feet clanked harshly on the metal steps, shaking the edifice as I climbed it, and when I got to the top, I pushed through the door and turned to slam it behind me. He was 2 or 3 steps back, his feet leaving little red splotches on the grates, and when I slammed the door, he shrieked in fury. I'll remember that hellish chase for the rest of my life, and I know it'll follow me whenever I close my eyes. David was still shaking as he finished telling his story, and I felt sorry for him as I finished up my notes. It really seemed like this place had it in for him. I've been working at this hospital for 29 years, 30 in October, but this is the strangest it's ever been. I don't feel welcome here no more, kid, and I think when the board brings up retirement again this year, I might just take him up on it. I'm getting too old for this shit, and I don't think I have another chase like that left in me. He left shortly thereafter, and I asked Carl about it. He just shook his head. The story he told the cops was that a homeless guy had gotten into the basement and must have escaped before they got there. I stuck by it, but I saw the footprints on the stairs. I'm not sure Custodial will ever manage to get them off, and I know Dave will lose it next time he has to go down there and seize them. I got back to work, but I silently thought that retirement might be the best thing for David. Would that we all got to escape the hospital that easily. You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them, shall we? Thanks to Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet and Lady Vengeance for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you think you might like to support the show in a more monetary fashion, come on down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find one that suits you best. I always recommend the Ghostly Reader tier, since you get a signed book anytime I write one on your doorstep. But I have many tiers, and again, I'm sure you'll find one to suit you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.